Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tea with TPS. Today we have a very distinguished guest from Goa, Shanti D'Souza. She's an author, she's a teacher, she's a strategic thinker, and with many activities, particularly relating to Afghanistan, terrorism, and all kinds of evil things that she's dealing with. Shanti has written several books. She's been all over the world. It'll be very difficult for me to capture all that, and therefore I shall start asking her. Welcome, Shanti, and please tell our viewers a little about yourself. It's a very adventurous life, I know. I have never seen a lady who has lived in Afghanistan for 10 years. So it must have been a real adventure, and the circumstances which took you to Afghanistan and the amount of work you have done in Afghanistan is very impressive. But on a personal level, how did you adjust yourself to that kind of a situation? Afghanistan, more than anything else, is a bit of a misogynist country also, I presume. And therefore, you must have had very interesting experiences. So can you share with us some of those?
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for having me on this show. It's an honor and a privilege, and especially to speak on Afghanistan from the west coast of India, that is Goa. Afghanistan has been my love story. I mean, that's one country you just fall in love with whenever you go there. So my first visit to Afghanistan was on a field visit in 2007, and since then I've not stopped going there.
You went on behalf of an NGO or something? What did you do?
No, I went as a part of my field research when I was with the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. After much seeking permissions and all of that, I finally got to go because that year was difficult. There were attacks on Indian mission and even on the Indian embassy where we lost.
Was it was the Taliban days? Was the Taliban days? Or?
No, it was post-Taliban days. It was at the time when there was an attack and one of the diplomat and the defense attaché got killed.
Oh, that time you were there.
And I really had to go because, for one, my PhD was on US policy towards Taliban, and I wanted to go during my doctoral days. And somehow that didn't occur because no one in Jawaharlal Nehru University would actually take me seriously. And thereafter, when I joined IDSA, I was hoping that I'll get a chance to go. So after much pursuance on this subject and not giving up on the idea of going to Afghanistan, I did end up in Afghanistan. And I was restricted to just Kabul, but then I broke the norms and I went to the provinces. I visited the Indian consulates in the provinces, especially in Herat and Jalalabad and Mazar-e-Sharif. And the first trip itself was so interesting that it just sucked me in. And then I think began a love story with Afghanistan. And despite all the troubles and the perceptions people have on Afghanistan, I think there's many myths that need to be debunked. And you're totally wrong. Once you get to Afghanistan, you're treated with so much of respect and so much of love that you just feel like going back there. So I had to cover my head a couple of times. I had to wear this full-sleeved salwar kameez and all of that. But given the fact that when you're with these people there and in sync with their local traditions and norms and the respect you get out of that, more so because you're an Indian, that is fascinating. So my subsequent trips were from Singapore, and I went to Singapore for this reason that I had a deal with the institute there that I get to go to Afghanistan more frequently, because I really didn't believe in being an armchair specialist or a researcher who would sit in an office in one of these cities and just write based on secondary research. I had to get to the field. So thereby, I took on various assignments and tried to see Afghanistan through various prisms. And every aspect of Afghanistan, as much as I've tried to probe and get to know more about this country, it's always been a mystery that it just stuck me in. So initial trip was a field research with the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. And thereafter, I went from the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, for my field research again. And also, I did various assignments with different organizations, including the UN Mine Action, ActionAid International.
I saw
I
also
also-
government. You also worked with the government of Afghanistan. That looks
Yes,
strange. So what did you do?
I worked with the local governance department, which is known as Independent Directorate of Local Governance. It's a kind of a quasi ministry there, but it deals with local governance, which deals with provincial councils. So since I'd seen Afghanistan through the security prism and the political prism as well, when I was an election observer, this assignment with the government and with the department was to improve local governance and accountability. And thereby I worked 1 year there. And that was a difficult period of time because it was between 2015 and 16 when there was a lot of uncertainty and there was a lot of polarization in the sense of difficulties within the government itself. But the fact that I was able to work with the locals, with the Afghans, and try to do something more meaningful than just research, to see if there's a practical value to research and if it helped anybody. That I think was very interesting and useful.
By that time, India's work had started. India had started reconstruction activities and building and all that. Is that at the period, or what was it later? India got it.
India stepped in immediately after the 9/11 attacks and the intervention of the US that occurred on October 7th, 2001. And during the Bonn conference, India played a very important role. So India stepped in immediately. It got that space and it used this development and aid policy to help Afghanistan rebuild itself. And most of India's projects were aimed at either the infrastructure development, capacity building, health, education, small development projects. And they were generally spread out all over Afghanistan. In difficult and insecure areas, India used the small development project model, and it worked pretty well. So one of the studies...
How these two things coexisted? On the one hand, there is a rebellion going on and the Taliban must have been creating trouble and so on. And at the same time, we send our people there for work. I never been to Afghanistan, but I dealt with Afghanistan at the UN, etc. So the picture that one had was, it's a totally lawless country. Maybe it is wrong, that impression. And even after the Americans went there, things were not totally under control. So in that situation, how do you work so continuously, say for a year, and etc.? Was it easy to do?
No, it was not easy. It was challenging, but the fact is that it was useful. I mean, you had to be on the ground to do something meaningful and substantial. There was no point in doing secondary research, as I mentioned before, and more so because everybody was in a hurry to leave Afghanistan. So Indian projects worked, and there were times when Indian projects and personnel were targeted, and thereby there was a challenge of doing reconstruction in Afghanistan. And I think India did pretty well by adopting this means of using soft power, that is giving aid to the Afghans based on their needs and priorities. And thereby there was a certain amount of buy-in and ownership as well. So one of the projects I did was to look at India's role, and I think India has played a substantial role and a very useful role. But at times, I do feel that it has been a minimalistic role. India could have done much more in the initial period, but no one was really ready to invest so much in Afghanistan, which in New Delhi was seen as a country of secondary importance, given that most of the policy focuses around Pakistan and China. And thereby, I think we lost that initial...
Not that it was of secondary importance. We considered it important enough. But we are always afraid that Taliban might come back under some arrangement or the other. And then we'll go back to the old days where, there was a lot of violence against the Indians. But what happened to the Indian population? Were they still there? Or many of them came away as refugees to India during the Taliban time?
Many came, but many still live there. Like the Sikhs are there. And in Kandahar, there's a doctor who is a Sikh and who is very well respected and liked by everyone, including the Taliban. So your earlier question about the Taliban and Indian projects, there was a certain amount of appreciation even among the Taliban foot soldiers about India's projects. And that came in very late. Towards 2014, you did see a certain kind of overtures by this kind of Taliban foot soldiers. And in one of the interview I did with Maulvi Kalamuddin, who was the deputy vice chief of virtue under the Taliban regime, he had a very different outlook towards women and modernization and state building. And he's the same person who used to whip women for wearing heels or lipstick and not covering their head, and even smashing TV screens, going inside people's homes. But that you did see a certain amount of change coming in over time. And gradually, I think the Taliban, with the rest of the international community, realized that Indian projects have been useful. So there was a certain amount of appreciation, and thereby I think there's not much concern that Indian projects will have to be wound down. It's about how India will evolve its role in the situation as it unfolds now, given that there are talks of this US troop withdrawal and also a rush to reach a peace settlement. So anything which is done in a hurry is going to have its own repercussions, and that's when I think India has to take note of these issues.
Okay, Americans were there in large numbers when you went. American troops? And
Yes.
they were visible, they were present all over the place. Or how was it?
Yes, you could see them, and interestingly, like everyone would avoid international forces, more so the American forces, because you are sure to be a target if there's a convoy passing by, right? And on the other hand, if there is a convoy passing by, you have to avoid because they need that much of space. So you just had to take a side ways and wait for this convoy to pass, and then there was this armored vehicles and all of that. And interestingly, every visit to Afghanistan, I noticed that the barricades and the Texan barriers kept increasing. So the first visit in 2007, I did see a lot of development, a lot of malls coming up and hotels being open, women stepping out to buy clothes and all of that. But that changed subsequently, and from 2014 onwards, you hardly saw any of this. So even the shopping mall or the shopping complex would be under barricades. And interestingly, US embassy was so barricaded that you couldn't even see. It was just a Texan barriers out there. So that was the irony of the situation, that they had so many troops, but they were just inside the embassy. And likewise with many more embassies, they wouldn't even use the road anymore. They would use choppers. So, and the popular joke among Afghans is they're going to buy fish and chips. You know, that kind of a scenario where you don't see the Europeans or the Americans out in the streets, and they are functioning from their green zones and
Did
everything.
Did you socialize with the people? No.
Not with the people as much, because I think the security risks were high for them, and at times they were not led to. But that was not true for the Indian embassy or for people from South Asia. It was much easy for someone from India or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka to get out and do work among the Afghans. And I think that's when that cultural affinity really worked in. And also the fact that we know how to function in those traditional societies. And as you mentioned this myth about Afghanistan, I think there's many myths about Afghanistan that needs to be debunked. Afghanistan has changed dramatically from last 19 years of the intervention. You see a lot of youth which is like used to this technology. You also see women who have come out and now working, and you see despite all those negative stories you heard about Afghanistan, there's also been progress. The number of girl children going to school has increased. And there is a general change in at least the major cities. I wouldn't say about the countryside, because that still remains backward. But in major cities like Kabul and Kandahar and Mazar-e-Sharif or Herat, Jalalabad, you do see some kind of progress. So those myths that the Afghans are tribals, they're lawless, they wouldn't want modernization, and I think it's not true. And I can say that because for one visit in Kandahar, I did speak to the locals there, and there was this farmer who wanted his child, a girl child, to go to school and to be a doctor, because there's no medical doctor for women out there. So, and also that you don't have any women dentists, and it's a cultural thing for Afghan women to go only to women doctors or to women dentists. And if they have issues, they can't go to a male doctor. So I think all those things were not carefully thought about when the international community went into Afghanistan. They went with the project of modernization in the sense of making Afghanistan like the West. Afghanistan can't be like the West or can't be like anybody else. Afghanistan is Afghanistan. It has its own traditional mechanisms. It has its own traditional democratic structures like the Shuras and Jirgas. And it has its own way of doing things. So instead of working with the Afghans the way they wanted it, I think this idea of imposing foreign ideas or Western ideas didn't actually help Afghanistan. And therein is my critique of the nature of the international intervention. Well, you can always say that how do we go back to the Shuras and Jirgas? Like, for instance, in India, you have panchayat systems. The international community could have explored a hybrid model wherein you use the traditional structures, build on that, and gradually transition to a modern state structure. That didn't occur. So my favorite assessment or saying about Afghanistan is a laboratory where every country has tried its experiment. And if it fails, it's easy for that country to walk away from it, but not for those peoples who are the subject of that experiment. And that's what Afghanistan is witnessing today. So everyone came in.
Shall we go back to the history from the time the Americans went there after 9/11? And their idea was to go and quickly eliminate this government, destroy them and come back. But even today they are there. So how did this happen? How come the Americans could not succeed in their original fight against terror?
Well, I think initially when the US went in under Bush administration, it was supposed to be a very limited military intervention. It was not meant to be nation building exercise at all. The only objective Bush administration had at that point of time was to bomb them to Stone Age and see that the Al-Qaeda is punished for what it did. So in the process of that intervention, nothing was clearly thought about, and Bush administration attention gradually shifted to Iraq in 2003. But between 2001 and 3 itself, if you look at it, Afghanistan needed more troops compared to other military interventions like Bosnia, Kosovo, and all of that. The troop ratio for Afghanistan was very less. So in the initial period of stabilization following the military intervention, the troops were simply not sufficient. Moreover, there were other countries, like the NATO countries which joined it, they had their own national caveats. So if one country wants to do particular tasks like just fighting, the other country wants to do peacekeeping. And these national caveats did not let them have a unity of effort, and they didn't have a unified command because of that. And most of these efforts were decimated. So in the process, the Taliban, which were there, just weren't taken to task the way they should have been. They just escaped and went into the tribal areas, and from there they went into the neighboring country, Pakistan. And from where they were able to...
So the Americans had
from there they were able to carry on the guerrilla warfare, and this continued. They did their regrouping, they got their arms, they got their bases, and then from 2005 onwards, we did start seeing the signs of the revival of the Taliban insurgency. And today, the Taliban insurgency is just not the Taliban which was there in the 1990s. It's a whole conglomeration of huge number of groups associated with the Taliban. So you still have the Al-Qaeda, you do have Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Hizb Islami, then there are IMU, then there is the Uyghur Muslims, and the whole load of international groups, in addition, 30 plus groups which have been mentioned. In addition to that, you also have the anti-government elements, the smugglers, the drug dealers, and all of them coalesce into this.
How did they all come to this place? What was the attraction for all these terrorists and groups to come to Afghanistan? Was it to fight the Americans or it was separate?
Initially, it was to fight the Americans. No, they were there. From the 90s, they were there in some form. And then during the Taliban regime, Al-Qaeda and Taliban were like symbiotic twins. They couldn't get separated. And then after 2001, those linkages never broke. They still existed. So
and Osama bin Laden himself was there. Osama bin Laden himself was in Afghanistan at the time
of Afghanistan. Yeah, that can't be said for sure. But he had association with Afghanistan. He was there. US tried to get him out even before 9/11, but didn't succeed. But after 9/11, he was hiding somewhere in the Tora Bora region, and thereby afterwards, you know where he was found. He was found in Abu Dhabi.
Pakistan.
Yeah, so that's right. So that shows the kind of linkages the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and the neighboring countries have. And in addition to that, you have this Haqqani network also associated with it. So it's not that everyone came to Afghanistan. It's like these groups existed in these tribal areas. Then they found bases in some cities, and from there they were able to carry on the activities. And today we also see the presence of the Islamic State, the Khorasan province in Afghanistan. So things have got very complicated with the military strategy adopted by the US and other Western countries. And I think the lack of a vision and a lack of a common goal of having a stable Afghanistan itself has been detrimental to this whole military experiment which these countries have carried out.
No, but that is what, since I've not been there, the feeling that so many of these groups, etc., have accumulated there, did they have a common mission, or all of them had different aims? Like, for example, Lashkar-e-Toiba and others, maybe coming from Afghanistan into Kashmir, they must have been active that way, while some others were fighting the Americans. And most of them were in cooperation with Pakistan. But Pakistan actually was supposed to be cooperating with the Americans at that time, isn't it? The partners were Pakistanis at that time. No, they had the choice of asking us, but they didn't ask us. They asked the Pakistanis to help them in this war. And that was unusual. We thought that, how would they accept Pakistan, which is already helping the Taliban? Why should the Americans take them as partners? We had a lot of conversations in Washington and New York about that. But they felt that an Islamic country might be a greater help to them to deal with the Taliban. But all that did not work out. The Pakistanis were cheating them all over. Throughout, they were working on both sides.
That was unfortunate because I think it was more a function of the geography as well, because the US needed Pakistan for the transit and supplies. And every time they had difficulty with Pakistan, the supplies would be stopped. And the same situation Afghanistan faces with Pakistan, because it's a landlocked country and it's totally dependent to the access to the sea on Pakistan. And thereby, India also has this issue, because if you look at the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, that never took off. And today you do have some amount of movement of goods from Afghanistan to India, but no goods are allowed from India to Afghanistan by Pakistan. So those kind of difficult relationship, in addition to the insurgency, has complicated things for Afghanistan, that beyond the security issue, the economics also have not been working to its advantage. It continues to be dependent on aid. It's seen as a rentier state. It's not able to generate its own revenue. And more importantly, most of the countries have not worked on building that economic model inside Afghanistan by which it can have its own revenue, not depend on outside sources. And that is very important for a sovereign country. Particularly if you have to pay salaries to your bureaucrats, you have to have some kind of income coming in, or even you have to pay for the army you're building, which is substantially large at this moment. I think that's when too much of focus has been on the security, and not as much attention has been paid on the economic stabilization aspects of Afghanistan. And herein we do have more troubles coming in, because as the interests of the West and particularly US declines, there will be a kind of a scenario where this economic bubble, by just having flushed in aid, is not going to be sustainable for long term. And that's another issue.
What was the economic situation? Your usual services, goods, etc. Market open, and a normal life was possible.
Yes, normal life was possible because there was money coming in to a certain extent. But the fact I'm trying to make is that Afghanistan's revenue base and agricultural base had not been developed to such an extent that they could have that kind of income coming in from this kind of economic opportunities. And interestingly, people who are unemployed turn to the insurgency. And that again becomes a problem. So I think it's important that we look at the economics as well when we talk about the security, because I think they can't be dealing. And therein, your first question about the early intervention and Bush administration could have done much more, just not in terms of nation building, but even the entire counterterrorism and counterinsurgency approach these countries had taken in. Counterinsurgency can't work well if you don't have that kind of governance and economic opportunities for the people. How do you get the allegiance of the people? And how do you make the government more responsible and accountable? How do you extend the writ of the government to those periphery and marginalized areas which are inaccessible to a large extent even till date? And those are the areas where the Taliban influence has increased. And you see that when you hear this media reports of like this percentage of the territories controlled by the Taliban, it's more because there is no sustainable kind of economic measure which could have helped build that allegiance and that kind of ownership with the Afghan government. And therein, I think we do have issues when we're talking about economics. But on the whole, Afghanistan and Afghans have tremendous potential. There could have been various models which could have been tried out in terms of the regional economic cooperation, in terms of bilaterals, in terms of having free trade zones, linking Afghanistan to Chabahar port through Iran, which India tried. So there are many such options on the plate. But the fact is that because of the security situation, everyone tries to work around the security and then forget the economics. And then it's like a chicken and egg dilemma because one without the other simply doesn't work.
Now, how about the Northern Alliance? We had a good relationship.
I didn't think it really exists the way it did in the 1990s, and India gradually in the last 19 years has broad-based its support and its aid policy to include all kinds of groups. So there's not one particular constituency India deals with now. Northern Alliance in the 1990s, especially during the Taliban regime, was a necessity because that was a recognized part of the government. Taliban wasn't recognized other than by 3 countries. So, that relationship has changed in many ways because now India has invested in the Afghan government. It wants to see a stable democratic government in Afghanistan. And it also has a certain amount of involvement with the Pashtuns now. And so it has not really nurtured or maintained those contacts with the Northern Alliance the way it did. And thereby, Northern Alliance itself has changed in its form and content after Masood's unfortunate assassination.
Abdullah is still belongs to Taliban.
Yes, he does. He does.
As we are talking, he is in Delhi.
Yeah, he's in Delhi on the peace process. Yes, he is, but there are others who have moved out, and there's a constant reconfiguration occurring on that count itself. So that Northern Alliance of the 1990s is not the same as today, just like the Taliban of the 1990s is not the same as you see today.
Let's talk about the American game. Obama himself wanted to withdraw after installing a non-Taliban government. That's what they were trying to do. But slowly and gradually they started engaging the Taliban. So now what they're thinking of is Doha Agreement and all that. They're thinking of is to hand over part of the government to the Taliban. So how will it benefit them? Because will they be able to suppress terrorism like that? Will not terrorism increase when the Americans leave? That kind of problem, how will it be tackled?
Well, I think when President Obama took over charge and he was talking about the Afghan war, he was very categorical in saying that it's a just war and it's a right war vis-a-vis Iraq. So they went in for the drawdown in Iraq and focused on Afghanistan. He gave in to his general's request of having extra troops and adhering to a counterinsurgency strategy. But in addition to that, in his AFPAC strategy, he also mentioned a date of withdrawal. And therein, I think that led to a lot of problems in the sense like there was tension in Afghanistan and the region, and the Taliban knew that they just had to wait their time. And thereby, from then, 2014 onwards, you did see a kind of a revival of this Taliban because they were waiting for the troops to withdraw. Likewise, with the Trump presidency, initially during his so President Trump, with his new strategy, went in for a CT++ strategy of having more troops and then trying to extricate himself from the situation by moving ahead with this peace process for his re-election bid. So we see what is happening in Doha as just a consequence of this American electoral timeline and not the Afghan needs or Afghan conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. So what we are witnessing gradually is this rush to reach for a peace settlement, and in the hurry of doing so might create more problems for Afghanistan. Because if you remember the Doha process, which started in September last year, and President Trump was very close to making an announcement and then reneged on that. And finally, it was signed on February 29 this year by the US and Taliban. It's basically an agreement between US and the Taliban, which had kept the Afghan government excluded for considerable amount of time. And in between, we also saw those entire political drama being played out with the contested elections and the political polarization which has taken place between these two camps, between Dr. Ghani and Dr. Abdullah. And that created more a situation whereby the deal itself was questionable whether an external mediated deal can be implemented in Afghanistan, whether there was any kind of Afghan ownership towards it. And as we're progressing, we realize that there's this whole issue of this intra-Afghan dialogue and intra-Afghan consensus, because I think there was a certain amount of anti-Ghani sentiment during the presidential election, which rallied a lot of groups, even from the Northern Alliance, towards the Taliban. And that was interesting because that entire permutation combination had changed. And what we are witnessing now is that there are a lot of elites from Afghanistan who are in Doha talking about this peace process with the Taliban, and things haven't progressed. And there are issues with the deal. For instance, the whole issue of US troop withdrawal. There is also this question of reduction of violence and cessation of violence, whether there has to be a ceasefire, and without a ceasefire, how do you have a deal? And if you have a deal and if it has to be implemented, what kind of government or political system will you have? Will it be an Islamic Emirate or will it be an Islamic Republic the way it is now? And also this concern of all these gains, however fragile they were gains in the last 19 years, particularly in terms of the women's rights, in terms of minorities. And there were not many red lines which were issues of concern for Afghans. And what we see today is Afghanistan, and it's going through its own transition. But the paradox of it is that it's also facing a lot of fatigue. There's a war fatigue which has developed in Afghanistan because ultimately the Afghans know that they will be at the receiving end. They are caught between the Taliban and the international forces, and there's a lot of bloodshed. And this is unending. So they just want this to stop at some point of time. And what is the cost for that? Well, that's not really thought about at this point of time, because there is also this concern if the US troops leave and the international community leaves them again the way they did in 1990s, then it will be back to that civil war situation. So how do you prevent that? So Afghans are taking more responsible position in that sense and trying to hold on the little bit of gains they've achieved in this last 19 years. And interestingly, you see many Afghan women who have come out in support and are talking to the Taliban in Doha. And that's an important milestone, because I think for Afghanistan and for the women in that country, it's important that their voices are heard. They've taken to many social media platforms as well to make their concerns known. And therein they have built that own constituency and that kind of a support base by which I hope they will be able to retain those gains and not go back to those days. But as you see,
shall we talk about India a little bit? India has always been on the margins of this crisis, isn't it? We have, in the past, UN had not included India in any of these consultations. I remember when we were in New York, we kept repeatedly telling the Secretary General that we have an interest. But they kept saying that, you don't have a common border with Afghanistan, all kinds of excuses. Those are, of course, because of Pakistan's support. So India was never in those multi-party talks, etc., in New York and Geneva and so on. So then we got identified ourselves with the government, Mr. Ghani, and close to the government. And the Americans on one side, Mr. Ghani on the other side, Taliban on the other. We were merely like Trump was taunting us, saying that Indians built a library there or something. That kind of an impression that we are not a factor. But actually, India should have been a major factor in all this. And we shouldn't be afraid that if Taliban comes back, the old situation will again come back. So what is it that we are going to get after all this? Are our investments going to be safe? Will they still be respected, or will the Taliban destroy it? Is there a scope for us to work with the Taliban? So what is your take on that? India's own prospects in Afghanistan.
Well, I think for the last 19 years, India has a one-stated policy of supporting the Afghan government and supporting Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled initiatives. Now, don't ask me what that
Americans to stay on. That was Dr. Manmohan Singh kept saying that we want the Americans to stay on, right?
Yeah, I think there was this broad congruence of interest between India and US that under the US security umbrella, India will continue with its economic activities and expand its economic footprint. So under the US military footprint, you had the economic footprint of India, which nicely converged in not many ways. But on the ground, they didn't want to work together. So even you had initiatives where the US officials were interested in working with Indians, but Indians were like, no, we don't want to work with the Americans, and to be seen as part of the American team. So because there were consequences of that on the ground. So there was this careful avoidance at many levels. But there was a broad congruence of interest because terrorism was an issue. For India, terrorism has always been an issue. And as you said, India has been kept out for much longer. And the fact is that in this 19 years, India has become an important actor, but still it doesn't play that role. So that is what... I have no idea why India doesn't want to step up, because either there are concerns that, if India does too much, it will raise the ante for Pakistan. So India shouldn't aggravate that situation. Or Afghanistan is not very important, keep it boiling enough so that Pakistan is busy there and doesn't focus on the eastern border with India. So these kind of thinkings, I think, have been very minimalistic. So India could have emerged as an important actor and could have had a say. So what India did in 19 years, support the Afghan government and support a democratic regime. But today that government is in trouble because it's being pulled from all sides. You have the US-Taliban deal occurring there. Internally, there are a lot of reconfiguration occurring. Regional proxies have started supporting their own initiatives inside Afghanistan. You can see what Iran is doing, what Russia is doing, what China is doing. Everyone's up to something. So India's stated policy of just supporting the Afghan government and being just following that line didn't help much, because for one, it didn't help Afghan government to be the strong actor it should have been. So if India had invested more in institution building, so India did build a parliament, which is a big symbolic structure of democracy. But how does the parliament function? How does elections take place? How do you have that kind of parliamentary system? No one thought about it. So as a result, you had a very strong centralized presidential system, which worked initially, but later on started creating problems inside Afghanistan. And so there was no rethinking or just looking back at how to work within the changes which were occurring inside Afghanistan. So one stated policy, support the Afghan government, maintain democracy there, which will help in peace and stability. That was the common point. But beyond that, to innovate, to imagine, to be more creative, of doing things in Afghanistan as a serious actor, that was missing. So if you talk to Afghans, there's a lot of appreciation of what India has done. They do see India as a good friend, and they like Indians and everything about Bollywood and all of that. But when it comes to serious business, why is India not there? Why is India not there on the table when peace talks are occurring? So that is something I think India has to figure out. Either it's shying away because it doesn't...
Originally, we were very reluctant to deal with Taliban. But later they
Exactly.
relaxed a little bit. But why is it that when is the Doha agreement going to be implemented? When are the Americans leaving? What is the understanding of that?
There's no clear understanding of that. I think this is just taking its time for the re-election of Trump or the election processes in the US is to unfold. So the latest statement from President Trump is all American troops will leave by Christmas this year. So, I mean, he wants to demonstrate progress in Afghanistan for sure. He wants to tell the Americans that I ended the longest war in American history. I've got the troops back home and I have a peace settlement and Afghanistan is peaceful. So at what cost and how does it come about and what are the implications of the peace deal? Well, no one is really bothered.
Which may mean that Pakistan influence will increase and that will create more problems for us. Pakistan Taliban kind of solution will make it difficult for us to continue.
Yes, if Pakistan has a say with the Taliban war in Doha, yes. But there are a lot of divisions within the Taliban, and my sense is that not everyone's on the board to talk in the peace talk process. There are few who are still back in the fighting arena who will continue their fighting strategy. So in that way, I think Pakistan will have certain influence. It will try to see a kind of combination wherein the Taliban are not back in totality, but in some form by which they can have influence in Kabul and keep the situation unstable to the extent that it suits their objectives. Because if you remember, when the Taliban was in power, despite being the proxies of Pakistan, they didn't adhere to everything that Pakistan said. And Pakistan has used concerns about the Durand line. So there are issues where Pakistan might not be very sure of having a complete Taliban takeover. One is this issue of this border. Second is also spillover. So if this group is emboldened again and the US troops leave, so Pakistan might have to deal with that kind of conflict spillover and with the kind of groups it has in its country. I think the consequences for Pakistan will be huge in dealing with this kind of groups. So thereby, I think Pakistan...
Was it Jayant Prasad who wrote just a couple of days ago on Afghanistan and the benefits that will accrue to us? It didn't sound very convincing to me, the way he was saying that this situation is going to be beneficial to India. Anyway, that we have to see. Just one more point.
It depends on how India plays its cards now and what it does, which is more meaningful. So at the moment, it looks like everyone's coming to Delhi to talk to the key persons and tell them what's happening. But one is not sure what New Delhi is really doing, because I think this is the space where New Delhi should be doing a lot more. It's a game of chess now. Everyone's thrown in their cards, moving their cards around, and then it depends on New Delhi of how it wants to see Afghanistan remain. And I think India has huge interest in stabilizing Afghanistan because it's just not the Taliban, it's those anti-India groups and their foreign terrorist groups based there.
We didn't mention two countries that are very significant in this whole process. One is Russia. I presume that Russia is kind of out of it. Occupation and Afghanistan and all that is over. They are not playing a big role there. I don't know whether I'm right. And China is trying to step in. China is trying very hard to step in. So what are your comments on these two? How are the Russians behaving and how the Chinese? And in this pro-Taliban era, what kind of role will they play?
Well, I think Russia has changed its position for the last few years. We have been seeing that. One is, I think there are concerns of the Islamic State presence, and there is a lot of conspiracy theories of who's funding whom and why is the Islamic State present in Afghanistan. So that is one. Second, they've made their own outreach towards Taliban and also by extension to Pakistan. So the question of India's Northern Alliance connection and those countries which were aligned with India then are no longer there for India now. So Russia has its own outreach and it's making its own overtures towards Taliban. And they, after the Doha process, they had their own peace talks with the Taliban, and likewise with China. So China was, if you remember, during the 1990s, was the first country went out and met the Taliban, and they have their own unilateral links with the Taliban, which they have retained, and that's not going to change. And likewise, China is also involved with the peace processes. So every country in the region is trying its own hand at the peace process and trying to be a facilitator, hoping to get something of the peace pie. So China and Russia are back to being with the Taliban. Russia has also made various overtures and various kinds of agreements with the Taliban. Interestingly, Iran is also playing
the
a
kind of messy situation will continue even after the Americans leave. Maybe it will become more messy. One doesn't know. Anyway, let us leave that and go on to your other interests like insurgency, IS, and you have written several books on Afghanistan already, and now you are doing one on Afghanistan-India relations, right?
Yes, that's a work I'm doing at the moment because
And the book which has now come out, countering insurgencies and violent extremism in South and Southeast Asia. What is that about?
This is actually an edited book where I got the scholars from the region to talk of their first-hand experience of dealing with insurgencies. So basically, there was not much of work done looking at South and Southeast Asia. So these various case studies of looking at insurgencies inside and the violent extremism itself is a phenomena which has not been studied.
In India, you mean Northeast and so on?
Yes, Northeast, we're talking about Jammu Kashmir, Northeast, and Naxals, the left-wing extremism itself. So these are the case studies wherein we looked at. I've looked at it through a very comparative prism and tried to extrapolate some lessons of what can be useful to the practitioner.
Are the Chinese supporting these insurgency groups in that area anymore? There are some reports that the Chinese don't interfere anymore in these areas. Is it true?
They say they don't interfere, but there is certain amount of linkages and certain amount of this which is not known in the public. But
arms etc. still come from China?
No, we're not sure of that because they're using different routes and different means of doing that. So you can't say it for sure that it comes from there. But yeah, certainly.
About Myanmar? Myanmar has a huge insurgency problem. When I served there, I knew. And there are a lot of linkages between the Nagas and others. And initially, the Burmese were never allowing us to have any joint operations. But recently, they have started allowing that. And probably that issue is not so serious now as it was at that time. Because I tried to persuade the Burmese to agree that we could have joint operations. But they were very much against it at that time. Because they were negotiating themselves with their own insurgents. And so they didn't want India to intervene in that. But what is the situation in Burma-India border, the smuggling that goes on, and so many other activities? Is it more peaceful and stable now?
It was for a certain extent of time, but I think we are seeing reports of things changing in there as well. During the past few years, India and Myanmar have cooperated, and I think that's one area where there has been good amount of cooperation on the border, especially with these groups, the Naga groups. And we did see certain amount of action taken by the Myanmarese army. And I think that is one success story. And second is we're also looking at the India-Bangladesh border. And there again, I think there is certain amount of cooperation and certain amount of complicity in the sense of how these groups have been able to, cross these borders, which are porous. So it's not just the
Rohingya issue complicated that matter, didn't it? Because the Bangladeshis are very concerned about Rohingyas coming back and many of them coming to India. But we took a pro-Myanmar position. And Myanmar is in deep trouble on account of that. So at the moment, our chief of staff has just been to Myanmar. I don't know if he has come back. Army chief and foreign secretary went together. That was an unusual delegation.
Right.
It's kind of reflecting the political structure in Myanmar, where you have a democratic setup as well as a military structure. So in the recent developments with China getting very difficult, Myanmar could probably play a role. I don't know what exactly was that we were trying to, because Myanmaris were very much close to the Chinese, and I don't know whether we could get any help from Myanmar in dealing with China. I don't know whether there is any angle like that. Do you have any knowledge about these linkages?
Well, I think India and Myanmar have shared that relationship, and I think that base which was set up still exists to a considerable extent. It all depends on how India reacts to certain issues in the neighborhood. So, without mentioning countries or issues, I think China has moved in substantially well in South Asia. Just not with its BRI, but it's also its outreach and its diplomacy. India, I think, will have to do a little bit more to step up to that. It's just not in Myanmar or Afghanistan, but rest of the countries as well.
Well, we have been visiting Al Qaeda, one solitary Al Qaeda man to catch. Sometimes you see Indians working for IS in India, particularly in Kerala. IS is supposed to have been destroyed or at least, suppressed in many parts. So these IS groups which are operating through Kerala, where are they going? Are they going to Afghanistan or are they going to the Middle East?
They are going to Afghanistan because I think there is a certain amount of pull factor and it's easy to access Afghanistan. So you see a lot of educated and affluent people from Kerala going and joining IS in Afghanistan. And that should be a concern because initially when we did try to do some research to Mantraya through this and mention the numbers, I think it's always a strategy to underplay or downplay this kind of threat. I'm not saying that you should exaggerate it, but I think to deal with it realistically is more important. To know that there are numbers of people who are going there, and this could lead to this kind of a situation and how to deal with that. I think that proactive policy or foresight itself has not been visible in security thinking, and thereby you do see a few like this. Interestingly, you also see many getting influenced by the social media. So there was this engineer in Bangalore who got indoctrinated by just seeing and viewing this IS websites, and some channel in London, Channel 4, came out with this story. And it's very surprising that you could get indoctrinated by just watching this kind of online content. So there again, I think we don't have much of a policy other than getting the individual arrested and putting him behind bars. But there's nothing much done on terms of preventing, being a little more proactive to curb this kind of radicalization which occurs. So we do see that kind of issues cropping up, and a security strategy which looks at issues of radicalization or counter-radicalization itself has not been well thought of. And so my book does cover aspects of this. And more so, as you said, you do have well-educated people and rich, affluent people joining. It's just not that those who are poor join terrorist groups. So there is something more which draws individuals to this kind of groups. And you've seen that in the West when it being lone wolf attacks or lone terror attacks itself. And that has not been studied in India because we can see the possibility of that occurring. It could be a whole lot of socio-psychological factors which drives an individual towards a certain group's extremist content. And how do you moderate that content? How do you monitor that content? And how do you educate people through community approaches? Building that community networks itself is a good strategy, but that again has not been thought about. And now we are in a COVID situation where we can't even talk to each other normally. So there are limits, but even again, we can do things online, right? So though we miss the interaction, between people and meeting people, but just the online itself.
Conversation's gone. Shanti, finally, can I ask you finally, what is the assessment of the IS in the world? Is it really strong, or is it going to come back again? How much have the Russians done about it? How much have the Americans done about it? Or is it going to come back again in big force later?
Yeah, I think it's always the probability of a group coming back because these groups are like amoeba, they just move in form and content. And if you see what happened in Marawi in Philippines, and that's one of the case studies, that's an interesting area to just understand how this phenomena can work out again. It can happen in Afghanistan, Pakistan border region, or it can happen anywhere else in Africa, which again is not well studied. And one of the latest reports which Mantra did again was on the Mozambique insurgency and its linkages to the Islamic State. So the Islamic State threat has not been diminished. And even India will face the consequences at some point of time, because this is a group which is morphing, and they work through various affiliates, and they are decentralized at this point of time. And it won't take much amount of time for them to come together, given that they have access to online content, and also they do have their own affiliates who are working with them. So I think it's the threat might not be really understood, and that's when the problem is. So I don't think IS is really disappeared in that sense. It's not a huge threat the way it was, but it exists, and it has the potential to come back.
And social media, they had used it very well. Remember those days when people used to think that those areas under IS occupation were prosperous and were at peace with each other, and that kind of impression they were managed to create. But that is no more there now. So, but still, I think it is dormant. And finally, can you tell us about Mantraya? What exactly are you doing in your organization?
Well, Mantra is a research forum where we try to give the space to young people to voice and express their views, to get newer ideas and fresher voices on subjects. So we do a considerable work in terms of strategy, innovation, and alternatives. And we engage a lot of young people, students basically, in terms of mentoring and also working on research projects, particularly in terms of security, governance, and regional cooperation. Also have projects on women, youth, and leadership. So we are looking into those areas which have not been covered by other institutes, and we're trying to.
Goa has considerable presence of strategists and thinkers and so on, don't they?
Yes.
College, for example.
Yes, there are. There are a lot of people. I'm just talking about the areas where not much of research has gone into, or not much of studies have been done. And so Mantra tries to work on its research base, or to build that research base, and thereafter do events, because it's not an eventful organization in that sense. It's more research and more focus.
Yes, I saw a number of young people on your website.
Yes, I think
very keen and very interested.
That's very important, because I think the mentoring part has been missing in India to a large extent. So when I was in Singapore, I used to get a lot of requests from young students in India, and I always thought that once I come back, we should do something like this, where we can engage the young people and have the good advice of the experienced individuals who are advisors at Mantra. So there's a good balance between the experience and the inexperience, and we are trying to bridge that gap and help the young students and interns build on their writing and research skills. That's the objective. But in addition to that, we do provide some consultancy, and we also do research projects, and we do put out research products on the website, which is a way of disseminating information for public use. And that's a way of giving back to the society in whatever little way we can.
Well, thank you very much, Shanti, for spending this time. Talking to you, it looked like I was talking to a world which I never knew. You know, it's all full of mystery and full of interest. Afghanistan, for example, and I really admire the way in which you have taken an interest in these areas which are not very well. You know, everyone likes to go to a think tank in Washington and read and write. But the kind of work that you are doing is you are in the battlefield, as it were. And that's why we call the subject of our conversation Afghanistan from the field. So it's very good to see you, how energetically and how effectively you're working. And you're taken to Afghanistan like fish to water, it seems, and with all these complications. So it was a delightful experience talking to you, and I hope our viewers have benefited. This is not a subject which often comes up in these conversations. So I very much appreciate your conversation, and also that book that you are coming up with that will be useful. India-Afghan relations, I think, a very standard book is required. So all the best for you and all your effort, and more power to your elbow, as they say, and all the very best. Let us get over this COVID situation, and maybe we can actually physically meet and talk about various things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's been a pleasure and honor again, and that was to speak on Afghanistan from Goa. And I hope to see you again soon.
Very good.
Take care. Stay healthy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Survival is success. That is it.
Absolutely.